Okay, so the topic of this video is the genetics inheritance pattern known as autosomal dominance. So let's get started. Well, remember the Henderson family? If you're in my biology class, we met this fictional family, Dylan and Maria Henderson. They have a 6-year-old daughter named Sophia. They have a 3-year-old son named Nicholas, and they just welcomed the birth of little baby Joshua. And we met them a few days ago in class when we learned that Joshua has the disorder PKU, phenylketonuria. It's an autosomal recessive disorder. And we learned that Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Henderson were each heterozygous. And this was autosomal recessive, where the disorder is recessive and healthy is dominant. But we're going to learn a different disorder today, a different pattern today. We're going to learn autosomal dominance. Well, let's expand this cartoon family here. Let's look at Maria's side of the family. Maria happens to be the oldest of 3 children. She has 2 younger brothers, Lucas, who is 29 years old, and Martin, who is 21 years old. And recently, their mother, Mia, has referred their father, Kevin, to the doctor because Kevin has become very unsteady while walking, and he seems to be more forgetful. He's also been dropping items that he holds on to, car keys and coffee mugs, and he's becoming very clumsy. So now we're bringing back our doctor here. And our doctor says, hey, we're pretty sure that your father is showing the early signs of Huntington's disease. It's an autosomal dominant disorder. So our doctor here is talking to the 3 siblings, Maria, Lucas, and Martin. Well, let's learn about autosomal dominance. First of all, an autosome is a non-sex chromosome. In this picture of a karyotype here, reminder that chromosome 23, the X and X chromosome if it's a female, or X and Y if it's a male, these are the sex chromosomes. But the other chromosomes, chromosomes 1 through 22, are known as the autosomes. There are no genes on these chromosomes that influence one's gender. Well, that's what an autosome is. And so autosomal disorders are caused by genes that are found somewhere on either chromosome 1 through 22. An example would be Huntington's disease. The gene responsible for Huntington's disease has been located, and it's been found on chromosome 4. So the cause of Huntington's disease is a gene located on chromosome 4. Chromosome 4 is an autosome, so Huntington's disease is called an autosomal disorder. And you might have heard of Huntington's disease because it's the disorder that shortened the life of folk singer Woody Guthrie, who sang the song, "This Land is Your Land, This Land is My Land." And he passed at a fairly young age due to Huntington's disease. Well, another example is a disorder called familial hypercholesterolemia. I hope I pronounced that right. More commonly just called FH. The gene for FH has been located on chromosome 19. Chromosome 19 is an autosome, so the disorder FH is an autosomal disorder. Well, let's go back to our 3 siblings here. Last time I was here to discuss baby Joshua, you said that he had an autosomal recessive disorder. How is this different? And our doctor says, well, if the disorder is recessive, then a sufferer must inherit 2 alleles to have the disorder. Because if the disorder is recessive, healthy is dominant, and the disorder is recessive. And so look at this combination. Homozygous dominant would result in a healthy individual. Heterozygous would result in a healthy individual who would still be called a carrier. And then the only way to have an autosomal recessive disorder is if you inherit not one lowercase allele from, let's say, the mom, but also a second lowercase allele from the dad. You would have to be homozygous recessive to have disorders like PKU, cystic fibrosis, and sickle cell disease. Those are examples of autosomal recessive disorders. But If the disorder is dominant, then a sufferer only needs to inherit one allele to have the disorder, and that's what we're learning today in this video. So the rule for an autosomal dominant disorder, that sufferers only have to inherit one allele to have the disorder. Notice how our key is changed. The disorder is now equivalent to the capital dominant letter, and healthy is recessive. And so when we look at these two combinations here, a person can have one of these two combinations to have the disorder. A person can either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. The only way to have the healthy non-disordered genotype would be to be homozygous recessive. That's the only combination that would result in being healthy and not having the disorder. So, as we just said a moment ago, there's actually two ways that a person can inherit this disorder. Now, the two ways are not the same. If a person is homozygous dominant, they tend to have a more severe version of the disorder. If a person is heterozygous, they tend to have a milder or less severe, a moderate version of the disorder. And the only way to be healthy, as we said a moment ago, is to have the genotype known as homozygous recessive. Well, if we look at the pedigree of these 5 people, Kevin the dad, Mia the mom, and then the 3 siblings, the doctor says, do you know if anyone else in your father's side of the family has suffered from HD, Huntington's disease? And Martin says, you know, our father was adopted, so we don't really know anything about his side of the family. And in a pedigree, if you ever see brackets surrounding a symbol, that means that the person's been adopted. So in this case, we don't really have any other information about their father's side of the family. And our doctor says, well, he must have inherited this disorder either from his biological mother or biological father. Because he has the disorder, I can go ahead and color in Kevin's square. And since he's 55 years old, he has to be heterozygous. He has the milder or the less severe version of the disorder. If he was homozygous dominant, then he probably would not have lived to be 55 years old. Now, your mother does not have the disease. And as we learned, if you don't have the disease, if you're healthy, then the only way to be healthy would be the homozygous recessive genotype. So your mother must have passed along a healthy recessive allele to each of you. But each of you has a 50-50 chance of inheriting this disorder from your father. Notice from the square there's a 50% chance that Maria, Lucas, and Martin could inherit their dad's capital H. And if that happens, they're going to have the disorder Huntington's disease. Well, let's examine this Punnett square here. We know their dad, Kevin, has the disease, Huntington's disease, and as we said, he's heterozygous. And we know their mom is fine. She's healthy. She does not have the disorder, so she has to be homozygous recessive. When we fill in the Punnett square, we see that there are 2 squares out of 4 that result in a person with the disorder. And there are 2 squares out of 4 that result in a person that is healthy. So each of them, Maria, Lucas, and Martin, they have a 50-50 chance of inheriting this life-threatening disorder called Huntington's disease. And so that's where we get the 50-50 odds from. And Maria says, you know, I'd like to be tested as soon as possible. I have 3 kids. I need to know my genetic future. You know, and the doctor says, you know, these test results will either be reassuring or devastating. Before testing is offered, each of you will need to speak with a therapist to help you cope with the results, whatever they might be. You know, we can arrange genetic testing if that's something that you wish, but please think it over. So before we conclude this story here, try to pause this video and try to answer this question. I'm going to go ahead and show the answer in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to work through this problem, there's the square representing Marcus and the circle representing Betty. And it says Betty and Marcus, they met at a support clinic they've been attending to help them cope with the knowledge of their illness with Huntington's disease. So each of them, Marcus and Betty, must have Huntington's disease. Now, because they're old enough to wed and produce a child, they have to be adults, which means they're heterozygous. Because if this is the moderate or the less severe version. And so people with the moderate, less severe version live long enough to reproduce and have children. And they would like to know the risk of having a healthy child now that Betty is pregnant. So maybe she's pregnant with a boy. So we can plot Marcus and Betty on the Punnett square now. And when we do, we fill in this Punnett square and we see that they can actually have a child born with the severe version of the disorder. They could have a child born with the moderate version of the disorder. They could have a child born with the moderate version of the disorder. Or there's a 1 in 4 chance they could have a child born healthy. So the question says they would like to know the risk of having a healthy child now that Betty is pregnant. Well, the answer to this is there's only a 25% chance that their child will be born healthy. So a few months have gone by. Let's bring the siblings back together for a conclusion. Martin, the spokesperson, says, as you know, our father has tested positive for Huntington's disease. Maria and I have recently tested negative, so they must be homozygous recessive. That's good news. Sadly, however, Lucas has tested positive for the Huntington's disease gene. He must have received their father's dominant capital H allele. And so the entire family has been attending support group meetings with Lucas. We've been encouraged and inspired by the stories shared from the other members. And as we wrap up, if you're in my class, pause the video, try to answer these questions, and I'm happy to check your answers before school or after school one day. So I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching.